Schools are supposed to feel safe. Quiet classroom, familiar faces, routine schedule. But teachers and tutors are often the first to arrive and the last to leave. In this video, you'll hear 3 scary horror stories from teachers and tutors, moments that happened after the bell rang, behind closed classroom doors, or during one-on-one sessions that felt, wrong. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, and let's begin with the first story.
I've always been a guy who finds comfort in logic. Numbers make sense to me because they don't lie. They don't have hidden agendas or emotional outbursts. 2 plus 2 is always 4. That belief is why I majored in data science. I thought I had a handle on how the world worked until my sophomore year of college. That was when I hit a brick wall called advanced probability models. I was failing, and I was failing hard. My academic scholarship was on the line, which meant my entire future was hanging by a thread. I was desperate. I found the flyer on a corkboard in the student union basement, tucked behind a poster for a dormant chess club. It was a simple, typed index card that read, "Master Statistics, Private Tutoring, Guaranteed Results. Ask for Arthur." There was a phone number and nothing else. No email, no website, no QR code. It felt old school, which I took as a sign of experience. I called the number immediately. The man who answered had a voice like dry leaves scraping on pavement traspy, precise and completely devoid of warmth. He introduced himself as Arthur, a retired professor who tutored to keep his mind sharp. He offered a rate that was shockingly low, but there was a catch. He did not meet in libraries or coffee shops. He only tutored out of his home. He claimed he had a bad back and couldn't lug materials around. Being a broke and desperate student, I ignored the red flag and agreed. Arthur lived in a duplex about 3 miles off campus in a neighborhood that felt frozen in time. The trees were overgrown, blocking out most of the streetlights, and the sidewalks were cracked ruins. His house smelled intensely of lemon furniture, polish, and old, decaying paper. Arthur himself was a small man, balding, wearing a beige sweater vest and thick glasses that magnified his eyes into unblinking saucers. He led me to his study, a room that I can only describe as a shrine to information. There were no books. Instead, the walls were lined floor-to-ceiling with black binders, hundreds of them. They were all identical, save for small white labels on the spines. For the first month, things were actually great. Arthur was a genius. He had a way of explaining complex variables that made them click in my brain. My grades recovered, climbing from failing to a solid B+. But as I got more comfortable, the atmosphere in that house began to shift. It started with the practice problems he created for me. You know how math word problems usually involve trains leaving stations or farmers counting apples. Arthur's problems were different. They were specific. One Tuesday evening, he slid a worksheet across his mahogany desk. The first problem read, "Subject A leaves his apartment at 8:05 a.m. and walks at a pace of 3.5 miles per hour toward the bus stop. The bus arrives at 8:12 a.m. if Subject A stops to tie his shoe for exactly 15 seconds. What is the probability he misses the bus?" I laughed nervously as I read it. I told him that Subject A should invest in Velcro shoes. Arthur didn't smile. He just tapped the paper with a yellow pencil and told me to solve 4x. I did the math, but a cold knot formed in my stomach. I left my apartment every morning at 8:05. I walked to the bus stop on 4th Street. And that very morning, I had missed the bus because I stopped to adjust my backpack strap. It felt like a coincidence, but it was a precise one. The following week, the problems became darker. The next worksheet read, "Subject A is alone in his apartment from 7 p.m. to 11 p.m. on Fridays. The deadbolt on the back door has a structural failure rate of 12%. Calculate the likelihood of a break-in occurring unnoticed if the subject is wearing noise-canceling headphones at 75 decibels. I put my pencil down. I looked at him and asked why the questions were so creepy. Arthur stared at me through those thick lenses, his expression flat. He told me that statistics is the study of reality, and reality is often unpleasant. He told me to do the math. I needed to pass the final exam, so I kept my mouth shut and did the work. But my paranoia was waking up. I started looking closer at the room. During a break, while he went to the kitchen to get water, I stood up and scanned the shelves. The binders didn't have math subjects on the labels. They had names. Sarah J. minus 2018. Mark P. 2019. Emily R. minus 2021. There were dozens of them, stretching back decades. I sat back down before he returned, my heart hammering against my ribs. I tried to convince myself they were just student records. Maybe he was just obsessive about tracking progress. The breaking point came last week. I arrived for my session 15 minutes early. The front door was unlocked, which was unusual. I called out for Arthur, but the house was silent. I walked into the study to wait. His desk was usually clear, but today it was cluttered with maps. I walked around the desk to see what he was working on. My blood ran cold. They were maps of the university campus, maps of my specific bus route, and blueprints of my apartment complex. Sitting right in the center of the chaos was a black notebook with a fresh label, Michael T. 2023. I know I shouldn't have touched it, but I had to know. I opened the book. It wasn't a grade book. It was a log of my entire life for the last 2 months. October 12th, subject coffee order changed to dark roast. Spent 4 minutes extra in line. Irregular behavior. October 15th, subject walked home alone. Streetlight on corner of Elm and Pine is burnt out. Success probability 84%, but a dog walker was present. Abort. I felt like I was going to vomit. He wasn't teaching me probability. He was using me to test his models. He was calculating the perfect statistical moment to abduct me. I flipped to the very last page. The date was for that night. The entry read, November 14th, heavy rain forecast. Subject end shift at library at 10 p.m. Shortcut through the park is flooded, forcing subject to take the alley behind the gym. No cameras, no lighting. Success probability 99%. I slammed the book shut. At that exact moment, I heard the front door creak open. Then, the heavy, deliberate thud of the deadbolt sliding into place. Arthur's voice drifted down the hallway, calm and detached. He asked if I was early. He said he hadn't finished setting up the equation for the night. I didn't wait to find out what the rest of the equation was. I grabbed a heavy brass paperweight from his desk and hurled it through the side window. The glass shattered with a deafening crash. I scrambled out, slicing my palms on the jagged shards, and sprinted into the night. I didn't stop running until I found a gas station with people inside. I went to the police immediately. They raided his house an hour later. Arthur was gone. The binders, they found them. The police wouldn't tell me everything, but they confirmed that the names on the spines matched a list of missing persons cases going back 30 years. Arthur wasn't just a tutor. He was a predator who used math to hunt. He treated human lives like variables in a cold calculation. I passed my stats class, mostly because the university wanted to keep me quiet and avoid a lawsuit. But I don't use numbers anymore. I changed my major to English. In stories, the villains usually have a motive. You can understand greed, revenge, anger. Arthur just wanted to see if the math worked out. And the scariest part? According to his notebook, he never leaves a variable unsolved.
My high school was less of a place of learning and more of a Gothic relic that the town refused to tear down. It was a massive looming structure built in the 1920s, a fortress of red brick and iron. The heating system was ancient, relying on massive radiators that clanked and hissed like they were in pain. And the hallways always carried a permanent, damp scent of wet wool, floor wax, and decades of dust. I was a senior, and I was exactly 1 credit short of graduating on time because I had completely blown off history during my freshman year. To fix my mistake, the administration gave me an ultimatum: take a night school recovery credit or stay back a year. The choice was obvious, but the execution was miserable. It was a recovery program in name only. In reality, it was just me and one teacher, Mr. Vance, sitting in a dim classroom every Tuesday and Thursday, evening from 6 until 9. Mr. Vance was the kind of teacher that students usually gravitated toward. He was young, maybe early 30s, with a sharp wit and a charisma that made you want to listen to him. He didn't treat me like a delinquent for failing a class. He treated me like an equal. He would sit on top of his desk, loosen his tie, and tell engaging stories about history rather than just droning on from the textbook. But looking back, I realized that his comfort was a mask. He was too slick, too rehearsed. The classroom we used was located in the west wing of the building, a section that was effectively abandoned after the final bell rang at 3 o'clock. The janitorial staff didn't even clean that wing until late at night, meaning that for those 3 hours, we were completely isolated in this massive, echoing building surrounded by rows of empty gray lockers. About 3 weeks into the course, the curriculum took a strange turn. We stopped discussing the Civil War and the Industrial Revolution. Mr. Vance started steering every single conversation toward what he called local legends. At first, I thought it was just a way to keep me interested, but his interest seemed to fixate on one specific event: the disappearance of a cheerleader named Becky Thorne back in 1998. It was a famous cold case in our town, the kind of tragedy that parents used to warn their kids about staying out late. But Mr. Vance treated it like it was the most significant historical event of the century. He brought in old newspaper clippings, photocopies of police reports, and even yearbooks from that era. One night, the atmosphere in the room changed. Mr. Vance leaned forward, his eyes gleaming under the humming fluorescent lights in a way that made my stomach turn. He told me that most people in town thought Becky had run away to California, but he insisted the timeline didn't fit. He stood up and walked to the door, pointing into the dark hallway. He told me she was last seen right there, right outside our classroom door, by the water fountain. I shifted in my seat, feeling a crawl of unease. I tried to steer us back to the lesson, asking if we could focus on the upcoming exam material because I really needed to pass. He just smiled, a smile that didn't reach his eyes, and told me that history is about what actually happened, not just the sanitized version that makes it into the books. He said we had a duty to the truth. Last Thursday, a massive winter storm slammed into our town. It was a blizzard, the kind that buries cars and shuts down power grids. The wind was howling against the windows, rattling the old glass in the frames with a violence that made me jump. The snow was coming down so hard outside that the world was just a wall of white. Around 7:30, the inevitable happened. The power died. The school plunged into total, suffocating darkness. The emergency backup lights in the hallway flickered on, casting a sickly, sterile green glow through the small square window in the door, but the classroom itself was pitch black. I couldn't see my hand in front of my face. I pulled out my phone to use the flashlight, desperate for some illumination, but Mr. Vance stopped me immediately. His voice cut through the dark. He told me to put it away. He said to let my eyes adjust because the darkness was atmospheric. His voice sounded different in the dark. It had dropped an octave. It was deeper, heavier, and lacked the friendly teacher tone I had grown used to. I put the phone down on the desk, screen down, but I didn't lock it. I told him I thought I should go home because the roads were getting bad and my mom would be worried. He told me the class wasn't over and that I hadn't been dismissed. I heard the creak of his chair as he stood up. Then, I heard him begin to walk around the room. I couldn't see him, just the sound of his dress shoes clicking on the hard linoleum floor. He was pacing in a slow, deliberate circle around my desk, like a shark circling a raft. From the back of the room, completely enveloped in shadow, he whispered that Becky didn't run away. He said she was waiting for her ride, but her teacher offered her a lift because of the snow. A teacher she trusted. My heart started hammering against my ribs so hard I thought he could hear it. I asked him to stop, telling him he was scaring me and that it wasn't funny. He ignored me completely. He moved closer, to my left side now. He whispered that the teacher told her he needed help carrying some books to his car. She was a good student. She was helpful. So she grabbed a box and followed him out to the parking lot. He stopped walking. I could feel his body heat radiating right next to me. He leaned down, his breath hitting the side of my neck. He whispered right into my ear, asking if I knew what her mistake was. I didn't answer. I was paralyzed, gripping the edge of my desk so hard my knuckles were white, my fingernails digging into the wood. He whispered that her mistake was not screaming when she had the chance. He said she was too polite to scream. I felt a hand brush against my hair, fingers trailing down toward my shoulder. Adrenaline dumped into my system like a bucket of ice water. I grabbed my heavy, stainless steel water bottle from the desk and swung it blindly into the darkness with every ounce of strength I had. It connected with something hard, his head or his shoulder, and I heard a grunt of pain and the sound of him stumbling back. I bolted. I didn't grab my bag, I didn't grab my coat, and I didn't look back. I just scrambled away from the desk and ran for the door. I burst into the hallway, where the green emergency lights made the lockers look like standing coffins. I could hear him behind me. He wasn't running. He was walking. He yelled my name, his voice booming down the empty corridor, echoing off the metal lockers. He screamed at me to sit down because I hadn't been dismissed yet. I didn't listen. I sprinted down the West Wing corridor, flew down the main stairs, and slammed my body into the emergency exit bars. The alarm shrieked, a piercing mechanical wail that shattered the silence. I tumbled out into the snow, the freezing wind hitting me like a physical blow, and ran to the main road. I flagged down a passing snowplow driver who let me sit in his cab while he called the police. When the cops arrived at the school 20 minutes later, they found Mr. Vance sitting at his desk in the dark, grading papers by the light of his phone like absolutely nothing had happened. He was the picture of calm. He told them I had an overactive imagination and had gotten spooked by the power outage and the storm. He was charming, rational, and acted like the concerned educator. Because I had no physical marks on me and he had a clean record, they let him go. They looked at me like I was just a hysterical teenager. But here's the thing that keeps me awake at night. The police retrieved my phone from the classroom desk where I had left it. I had left the voice memo app running because I wanted to record the dates he mentioned for the exam. I listened to that recording the next day. You can hear the wind, the power cutting out, and his story. After the sound of me hitting him and running out of the room, and the door slamming shut, there is silence for about 10 seconds. Then, you hear Mr. Vance sigh, a heavy, frustrated sound. And then, he whispers, clear as day, right into the silence. Almost. Next time, I'll lock the door first. I transferred schools the next morning. I heard Mr. Vance is still teaching history there. So, if you are taking night classes, and the charismatic teacher starts talking about local murders that happened in your town, don't wait for the lesson to end. Just leave. Take the F It is infinitely better than being the subject of the next history lesson.
Music has always been my escape from the world. After a particularly bad breakup that left me feeling hollow, I decided to finally fulfill a childhood dream and learn the piano. I wanted a hobby that required total focus, something to drown out the noise in my head. I scoured the internet and found an ad on Craigslist that seemed perfect. Classical piano instruction. Beginners welcome, $20 an hour. The price was a steal, almost too good to be true, considering most tutors charge triple that. The teacher was a woman named Mrs. Gable. She lived in a massive, dilapidated Victorian house at the very end of a cul-de-sac that backed up to a dense forest. It was one of those houses that looks like it is frowning at you, peeling gray paint. Overgrown ivy strangling the porch columns, and dark windows that reflected nothing but the sky. Mrs. Gable herself was about 80 years old, tiny, frail, and completely blind. She wore dark wraparound sunglasses inside the house, which added to her unsettling appearance. But she was polite enough. She navigated her home by touch, her hands fluttering over surfaces like moths. The lessons were held in the basement. It wasn't a finished basement with carpet and drywall. It was a dungeon. It had uneven concrete floors, exposed pipes dripping condensation, and a smell of mildew and earth. The only light came from a single naked bulb hanging directly over a beautiful, glossy grand Steinway piano that looked completely out of place in that rot. Mrs. Gable was a strict instructor. She would sit in an old wooden rocking chair in the corner, tapping her white cane to the rhythm. Because she was blind, her hearing was supernatural. She could hear if I missed a key by a fraction of a second, or if my tempo dragged even slightly. But by the fourth lesson, she started getting agitated. I was playing a scale, sitting straight, focusing intently on my finger placement. Suddenly, she slammed her cane down hard on the concrete floor, the sound echoing like a gunshot. She yelled at me to stop moving. I froze, my hands hovering over the keys. I told her I wasn't moving, I was just playing the scales. She hissed at me, claiming she could hear my shoes scuffing on the floor and my jacket rustling. She demanded I sit still because the extra noise distracted from the music. I looked down at myself. I was wearing soft canvas sneakers. I hadn't moved my feet an inch. I wasn't even wearing a jacket. I had left it upstairs in the coat rack. I apologized, assuming she was hearing things. Maybe old pipes settling or mice in the walls. Or perhaps her age was catching up to her mind. The next week, the behavior got worse. We were halfway through Moonlight Sonata, a piece I was struggling to master. The basement was silent except for the notes. Suddenly, she screamed at me to stop breathing down her neck. I jumped, hitting a discordant cluster of notes that rang out harshly. I turned to look at her. She was sitting 10 feet away in the corner. I told her I was at the piano on the bench. She looked confused, her head tilting like a bird listening for a worm in the ground. She asked if I wasn't standing beside her. I told her no, I was at the keys. She went quiet, her face draining of color. She whispered for me to just play, but to play louder. She looked terrified, clutching her shawl tightly around her shoulders. That spooked me. I wanted to quit right then, but I had paid for the month in advance, and I hate confrontation. I decided to get through one last lesson and then ghost her. For my final session, I brought a high-quality digital recorder. I wanted to record my playing so I could hear my mistakes later and practice at home to prove to myself I was making progress. I set the device on the far end of the piano, pressed record, and started the lesson. The atmosphere in the basement was heavy, almost suffocating. Mrs. Gable was rocking furiously in her chair, gripping her cane until her knuckles were yellow. She kept muttering to herself, telling herself to focus on the music, her voice trembling. I tried to ignore it and focus on the sheet music. Halfway through the lesson, she shouted at the top of her lungs, "Get away from him." I stopped playing immediately. The silence that followed was deafening. I asked her what was wrong. She swung her cane wildly at the empty air behind me. She yelled at the boy to get away. Then she turned her sunglasses toward me and asked if I had brought a friend. She asked if someone was there with me. I stood up, knocking the bench over with a loud crash. I shouted that it was just me. I was done. I grabbed my music sheets, shoving them into my bag. I told her I was leaving and that this was too much for me. I stormed upstairs, not waiting for her reply, and let myself out. I drove home, shaking, convinced she was having a psychotic break or suffering from advanced dementia. I felt bad for her, but I was also terrified. Later that night, I sat down with a stiff drink in my living room to listen to the recording. I wanted to hear how bad my playing actually was before the interruption. I put on my noise-canceling headphones, turned off the lights, and pressed play. I heard my clumsy piano playing. I heard Mrs. Gable's cane tapping against the floor. But then I heard the other sound. Underneath the piano notes, clear as a bell, was the sound of heavy, wet breathing. It wasn't coming from me. It was coming from the recorder, which was sitting on the piano. The breathing was right next to the microphone. My blood ran cold. I kept listening. Then I heard the sound of fabric rustling, like heavy denim moving against itself. A shuffling sound dragging across the concrete. At the part where Mrs. Gable yelled, "Get away from him," I heard a low, guttural growl. It was a human voice, but it sounded feral, like an animal backed into a corner. It whispered a single word right into the mic, "Mine." I tore the headphones off and threw them across the room. The scuffling sound she had heard, the breathing down her neck, it wasn't me. There was someone else in that basement. Someone who had been standing inches behind me while I played, circling the bench, moving closer to Mrs. Gable and then back to me. Someone who had been toying with us. I called the police immediately. They went to the house for a welfare check. They found Mrs. Gable unharmed, but they found something else. In the basement, behind a stack of rotting cardboard boxes near the piano, was a makeshift living space. There was a filthy sleeping bag, candy wrappers, bottles of urine, and a rusted hunting knife. A man had been living in her basement for months. He had been sneaking in through an old coal chute that had been pried open. He had been there during every single one of my lessons, watching me, standing behind me in the dark while the blind woman listened to him, thinking it was me fidgeting. They never caught him. He vanished into the night before the cops arrived. But the thought that haunts me isn't just that he was there. It's that he was listening. He was enjoying the music. And sometimes, when I sit at my keyboard in my own apartment, safe behind locked doors, I get this phantom itch between my shoulder blades. I have to stop and turn around just to make sure I'm actually alone. Because I know now that just because you can't see someone doesn't mean they aren't standing right behind you.
And that's all for tonight. Remember, the most terrifying monsters are the ones that look just like us. The ones who might even live right next door. If these stories serve as a good reminder to trust your instincts, then show your support and like and subscribe. Hitting that bell means you'll get a warning before the next nightmare begins. Sleep well, if you can.